All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. This is a special reading roundtable being put on by Gree Literatura. And we're going to get going here in a bit as more people arrive. I'll probably give it a few minutes. I'm going to ask that everybody, if you're, oh, I think I just said that, if you're one of the four of us, please remain muted. We do have, as we go through this, if you have questions and stuff or want to raise a point or just want to applaud something, feel free to jump into the chat and type it out there. Maybe if you have a question that you want to ask us, if you could put like a, a Q colon after it, so I can recognize it a bit, a bit easier. So let's see. I'm not sure if everybody here is from Minnesota or not, but I was walking out about an hour ago and we had snow. So yay, yay us. Okay, where are we at? Okay, I think we're going to get started. My name's David, and we are, this is a special reading roundtable put on by Gree Literatura, or if you're want the Italian or the Spanish, that would be Gris or Greece Literatura, on the intuitive arts and poetry. First off, I'll just introduce with us, with myself today, we have Paula Cisewski, Moray, and Andrea Grace. And we all, there's four arts that we're primarily, or four practices that we're primarily going to be discussing. Astrology, Labyrinths, the I Ching, and Tarot. And each of us primarily practice one of those things, but also there's some of us who have practiced several of those. And we're also all creative types. So first off, though, I just want to address the question, why is a literary nonprofit doing an event on the intuitive arts? And why are they the intuitive arts? First off, to address the second first, we're calling these the intuitive arts because they really, what they do is they open up, I feel at least, and we'll be discussing this, that they open one up to oneself intuition, or help to open other people up to parts of themselves that they're not able to access conventionally in their life. I think we've all kind of decided that we don't like the term esoteric arts, because the term esoteric in and of itself means that there are people who are not, who can't access them. That it's something that generally is for a higher sort of person, and we all think that's bullshit. So, yes. So that's where we're coming from with this. And with that, I'm going to just jump into the introductions. So I'd like to start off, introduce you to Andrea Grace.
Thank you, David. Beautiful introduction. Well, I'll be speaking today especially about astrology. And I have been studying astrology for really over 20 years. And it's been interesting to see this explosion of interest in astrology in the mainstream culture in, I feel like, the past few years. Because, 20 years ago, it was more fringy. And there was a lot of skepticism about astrology, and there still is, in many circles. But that has changed and opened up a lot. I mean, now Oprah Winfrey, has her own horoscopes that she offers to her readers, and you just read so much more about astrology everywhere. You hear so much more about it. So in a way, it seems like the stigma that has sort of existed around it seems to be, if not, dissolving altogether, it's shifting a little bit, or it's less all the time. So actually, the reason I even mentioned that is when I first started to study astrology, I was very closeted about it. Like, I didn't tell anyone about it because I didn't know anyone else who had that interest, and I didn't know anyone else that I thought would be supportive of it. So it's just been fun over the past decade to kind of out myself as an astrologer, and I started a business with giving readings about 7 years ago. And prior to that, I had given hundreds of readings, but I had just done it for free and I was getting burnt out. So I now do it professionally. And I can't tell you, like, every year since I started that business, it's just grown. And there's now I have a waiting list because I can't keep up because so many people want astrology readings and follow-up readings. So one thing I guess I love about astrology is that we can actually connect to it by looking at the planets and looking at the stars. And I think there's something that's so magical that happens, when there's a really visible Mars and you can really locate that and connect with that and really see this fiery ball in the sky. Because when you're just looking at an astrology chart, it remains fairly abstract and symbolic, but we remember it's actually always connected to, real cosmic matter. So I love that. And I also love how vast astrology is. So we consider the 8 planets and the sun and the moon and the 12 signs of the zodiac, but we can also consider the thousands of asteroids in the solar system, and we can also consider the way planets interact with one another. So the more you uncover about a chart, the deeper you can go. And it really truly is endless. Anyone who's studied astrology for any amount of time can attest to the sort of overwhelm / awe, of just realizing that you'll never know it all. You can never study it all. So I'm really in love with astrology, and I'm so happy to be here with these talented colleagues of mine. So with that, I will pass it to Moray.
I'm going to get off mute. Okay. Hello, I am Moray. I'm bad with introductions, but I'll try to keep it as simple as possible. I guess I'm an occultist first, and I've been doing that kind of thing maybe for 15 years. And the I Ching has been a very recent addition to my life, because now I'm actually allowing myself to surrender into this practice that is from an entirely different country, if not creative consciousness. So I have to really not only force myself to suspend my own ideas of what it's saying to me, but I also have to learn a new language. And I Ching, just so if people don't know, I Ching is a divination system that is from ancient China. And in the beginning, it wasn't necessarily a part of the Tao Te Ching or the book that everyone really knows about. It was a lot more mystical in the way that you viewed it. And it's 64 hexagrams. These 64 hexagrams are comprised of 2 trigrams. So that's going to be 6 lines. And these lines are attributed to particular elements in nature. And I enjoy the system because I'm very much a shamanic person, if I'm to use that language. But for the system itself, it is derived from a more animist perspective. So when you're casting the I Ching, you're actually trying to understand the elements that are a part of life and a part of, I guess, the archetypal force of what people are. And once you cast this, you're learning about not only temperaments and how changes happen in nature, but how it also happens in the human mind, and vice versa and all that. So I really, finally, now I'm accepting that, oh, this is very complex. And I think I want to take on that challenge of learning this language, but it's also so rich in philosophy and psychology. Even Carl Jung was someone who, adopted just the E for itself, and added to his own psychotherapy. So with all that being said, yeah, I dabble in a lot of different things, but this is my thing that I really like. And yeah, I hope to add some light or shed some stuff, and I pass it on to Paula, I believe.
So interesting. I just want to listen the whole time. Everyone, I'm Paula Cisewski, and I'm here and just really glad to be here, mostly as a poet and a writer who bought my first tarot deck when I was 19 years old, and never thought to use it in my creative work for so long, until, no, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, Rain Taxi Review of Books, that publication and organization, started doing quick tarot poems at events and fundraisers. And so I did a bunch of them, and then would write tarot poems for people at other kinds of charity fundraising kinds of things. So I really do think of myself still as a forever amateur. But it did prompt me to write like many poems also, then I'll talk about later with the cards. But today I'm also talking about falling in love with labyrinths. And yeah, I think I walked my first labyrinth in 2008 or 9. I had seen them before, and they seemed like something that didn't belong to me. And then in 2008 or 9, all of a sudden I was drawn to them the way maybe Moray, the way that you said, like the I Ching it's mine. Like this became mine. Like and I became obsessed. And so yeah, I will happily talk a little. David, is this the point where someone shares a PowerPoint if she has one?
Yeah, totally.
Okay. I feel like, I don't know, a lot of people have already always walked labyrinths, or you've seen them around, or insert David Bowie movie joke here, but
are you able to share your screen? There we go.
Yeah, I'm just very slow. I'm just very, very slow. Okay, so, oopsie. So, and just from the start. Okay, so I think this will just take a couple, let's see what it takes. I don't know. So Oh, I forgot that I have this auto. Enjoy all of the things it thinks I say and all of my kind of long pauses. So I have walked some labyrinths in Minneapolis, in St. Paul, in Madison, in Eau Claire, in Chicago, in St. Louis, in Austin, many other places. And I will share a website where as you travel, you can walk some labyrinths of your own. They become yours, I feel. So this one is outside Austin, Texas. You know, it's a meditation. It's a walking meditation. So it connects you in a somatic way to your body. You decide on a reflection, a question before you go in, and you decide to just hold it. You walk at your own pace if other people are walking too, and you walk all the way to the center, just holding this. So there's a Christian tradition where it follows purgation, illumination, and union. And in the Christian tradition, the center, there's a 6-petal like rosette in the center. But it all has to do with mother goddess imagery too. Like there are lunations around where you can count the lunar calendar, and the labyrs, where the word labyrinth come from, look like axes, and they have to do with feminine power. And yeah, so it all ties back to pre-Christian imagery too. But I wanted to share just a little bit from Lauren Artress's Walking a Sacred Path, where she talks about the path through silence. And this is just a couple quick. The path through silence is called the apopathic path. It's the path of meditation or contemplation, which leads us to the center of our being. So it's like a physical manifestation of a metaphor, right? And you walk through the apopathic path to get to the cathopathic path when you're walking a labyrinth, which is the imaginative process that guides us to the light within. So I find this, so that's where we get to our metaphors. That's where answers that aren't coming from the reason brain come to in a labyrinth, right? There's also the Greek myth, right? Daedalus, who was Icarus's father, was employed by King Minos to build the Greek labyrinth, right? As a prison for the quote unquote monster, right? The Minotaur, who has a name, it's Asterion, who's the monstrous offspring of Queen Pasiphae, and a magical sea bull, you know, thanks to Poseidon. So every year tributes, like 7 male and 7 female tributes were sent in as sacrifices to the labyrinth. And then Theseus is the hero who eventually goes in and kills the labyrinth, or kills the Minotaur with the help of Ariadne, who gives him that thread, right, and the pitch, and so that he can find his way back out. So I find walking the, this one is at St. Kate's, the one that was, the previous screen was in Chicago. Much like a way to get rid of linearity and list thinking and rationality. Even making a finger labyrinth and tracing it at home is a way to clear a mind. If any of you are Linda Berry fans, she has people often draw that tight spiral before you start to imagine your work. I find the labyrinth to be good for, back to Jung again, right? Shadow work, building one's interior world, considering ideas about imprisonment, self-imprisonment, even Keats' concept of negative capability, right? Being capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, and doubts without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. That's just holding a question and waiting for that capopathic imagery to come to you. It aligns in tarot with the Hermit very clearly. And let's see, yeah. So I would say I walk them fairly regularly, but to me that means like a few times a year. This one's in Eau Claire. Once a year, I teach a workshop called The Labyrinth of the First Draft that uses all of these tools as a way to break through blocks and to generate new work. This is just one I made with painter's tape on a studio floor before a reading. I have a prose chapbook called Misplaced Sinister that relies heavily on labyrinth and prison imagery, and then also a collection of poems called Quitter that's very infused with labyrinth imagery. And I'll also later share a short list of many other labyrinth-inspired pieces of literature and other resources that you might enjoy. Here's one time I went to the Como Labyrinth and it was snowed over, so I just made it up. The end.
All right.
PowerPoint.
Thank you. I'm David Bayliss, and I'm a writer, poet, musician, and actually, and I've done practice tarot with the same deck of Mother Peace cards that I bought over 25 years ago. And I kind of was a rationalist, so I'm surprised that I got into tarot, but it was definitely very incredibly foundational for my own personal growth. You know, I hate to think of if I had not encountered it, how I would be. So, and, you know, but I'd like to get into a bit of the history of tarot, because I feel that it's very misunderstood, and much like with a lot of this stuff, kind of overly mystified, and especially with tarot, needlessly mystified. So I too have put together a PowerPoint presentation, and went a little overboard and then tried to trim it down. So we'll see how it goes. See if I can share my screen. Okay, you should be looking at a fanned out bunch of cards. The tarot it has been claimed to be mystically of mystical origins, and that's not true at all. The first time that we ever encounter the term tarot, or its root actually in Italian tarocchi, is in the mid 15th century, 1400s. And that's with 3 decks, hand-painted decks that definitely the same. We don't know who the artist is, but it's assumed based on the presentations that's the same artist, and they were given to very, very rich people. So this here is probably the most well-known. It's the Visconti Sforza. There's also the Visconti Madrone and the Visconti Milan. And our belief is that they were commissioned from this artist all around the same time to be, you know, hand painted. There are slight differences. Tarot is divided up into basically two kinds of cards. We now call cards like this, generally these are considered the major arcana. So those are the cards like the Death card, the Judgment card, the Lovers, the Fool. And then there are what we know today as the face cards, the suits, which is where we get all of our this is where we get our face cards from, or suit cards for a regular, playing deck. So there were some differences. So they weren't really well codified at that point. The Sforza Madrone has like several major arcana cards that don't exist anymore: Hope, Faith, and Charity. Probably that was requested by the guy who commissioned it. So it kind of got codified around the end of the 15th century with a deck called the Marseille deck, which comes from Marseille, France. What you're seeing right now is kind of similar to that. They basically all got copied from that. This one is the Tarocchi Bolognese, so it's from Bologna. So all of this, these suits and the 22 major arcana got passed down. It's important to realize, though, that they weren't called major and minor arcana yet. What we call the major arcana was called the triumphe, or the trumps. Triumphe coming from triumph. So there were basically two kinds of games that got done, and this is all that these were for. They were not for divination at all. They were for basically playing games, versions of, and you could play several different kinds, and you could divide up the deck and play only with the trumps. And there were all sorts of like kind of icebreaker parlor games that you could play with it. Like you pass out a bunch of trumps to everybody at the table, and then try to figure out, based on those, what their personality was like. So that would, kind of break the ice at a party. And the other, obviously, with the suit cards, you could play, I don't know, gin, poker, whatever, whatever they had that was like that then. Then all this stuff disappeared. That's at the end of the 1500s. And then for the next 200 years, this disappeared. There are no decks that we found from this 200-year gap. And then the early 1700s, this French guy comes along named Coeur de Giblon, and he basically claims that, and there's little background that we know of this guy before he arrived on the scene, but he arrives in the French court, and he basically claims that he has discovered the ancient Egyptian roots to the Tarocchi, and that it comes from the god Thoth, Thoth. You're probably familiar with that term if you know anything about Tarot, or Thoth. And Thoth is, according to him, the god, and it actually is true, that this is true, that Thoth was considered the messenger, basically, or the recorder of history. So Thoth, he claims that Thoth, that the hieroglyphics and everything dictate these cards, and that the Tarocchi that was played in the 14th century was a copy of those cards, but the people just didn't know, the mystical background of it. He also claims, so there's this, at this point, there's this whole thing about Egypt. everybody goes into this whole, Egyptian wisdom thing, and that, the Greeks and their wisdom came from Egypt. There's also like the Romani people, he claims that they came from Egypt, which is why they then became called gypsies. And why, since they carry around these cards for divination, that supports his idea that there's a divine divination. And this kind of stuff goes on for the next, throughout the 18th century and into the 19th century. And then the 19th century, you get a whole bunch of characters coming into this. And I'm not going to go into that. But even in 1799, when they decoded the Rosetta Stone, they went to those hieroglyphics, and there's nothing about tarot cards in there at all. But that didn't stop people from believing that. So, probably the thing that comes up at the end of the 19th century that people know is the Rider-Waite deck. And this is an interesting deck because this is a very standardized deck, and for a long time this was the only tarot deck known or that people used until Aleister Crowley came along and developed his Thoth deck. This was developed by the Order of the Golden Dawn, and they're the ones who really kind of projected this whole idea that this is esoteric knowledge. It was knowledge that you needed to be initiated into, and they developed a lot of their rituals of initiation from things like the Masons and the Rosicrucians and stuff like that. And a big mover on this, and one of the guys who organized it actually was William Butler Yeats. And he had a big hand, he and his wife had a big hand in the development of these images. They were kind of, in a way, commissioned by them. And this is really the basis that we get all our tarot from now. Aleister Crowley actually developed his own order because Yeats specifically, along with a few other guys, thought he was dangerous. He wanted to be part of the Order of the Golden Dawn, and they said, no, you're batshit crazy. And then he went out and proved it that they were right. Into the 60s, we start to get a whole bunch of different versions. Suddenly there's this explosion of different kind of decks. And this is the deck that I use. They're part of this. This was developed at the very beginning of the 70s, I think 71. And it is the Mother Piece deck. And you'll note the interesting thing about the Mother Piece deck is it's circular. And I like it a lot because that creates a big subtlety. Cards can be not just upright and reversed, but they can be on their side and such. And then the interpretations there's a lot of subtlety. There was this explosion of creativity about how can you read these cards. You can take a look at the Mother Piece card for Judgment, and already from the 70s, you can see the incorporation of gay rights in there, and all of this stuff was feminist and anti-patriarchal, and that kind of turned our old Waite Rider deck on its head. And when I get to reading some stuff, you can see that. This is interesting. The death card for Mother Piece isn't like death running around with a sickle. This is a snake shedding its skin. It's not like, oh, you've got the death card, now you're going to die. It's, this is a transition. Something has died and you're moving to something else. Apparently, Christian Dior decided that this was going to be their big thing for, I think, 2019. So when I was looking for the Judgment card, I found a handbag with with this on it. And then for the death card, this was one of their dresses. So that was a big thing. Mother Piece Tarot was going to be their fashion, which kind of makes me feel kind of nauseous, but there you go. This is one of my favorite cards. This is the Priestess card. It's just a real good. So this is a Mother Piece version of one of the minor arcana cards. And even that, you can tell how kick-ass this is. It's not just simply like a Queen of Spades card or something like that in the deck. They changed the queens to be priestesses. They changed the kings to be shamans. There's rich imagery in all of these things. And that's why I love this deck. There are a lot of other ones that happen. This one is the Starman Tarot that just came out a few years ago. It's all based on David Bowie. So, yeah, there's a lot of crazy decks out there now to be had. Last thing I want to say, just I had said about minor arcana and major arcana. That terminology was developed in some point in the 19th century, might have even been by Yeats in the Golden Dawn. Arcana, obviously, they're referring to, oh, this is incredibly old knowledge and arcane knowledge, which, again, no, they're trumps and suits. That's what they are. So there you go. I am going to stop sharing now. I hope that didn't ramble on too long.
That was fascinating. Both of your presentations were fascinating. So I wanted to just step back for a second, since we're describing these four arts as intuitive. That's the word we landed on. So I just wanted to open up a conversation about what that word really means. Like when we say intuition, what are we really referring to? Can we just flesh that out a little bit more? And I'll say I'm relieved because I'm the one posing the question, but I'm not sure I have a good answer for it. So anyone who feels called to speak on that, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Okay. Ask the question one more time so I digest it properly.
Yeah. So the question, I guess, is just when we say intuition, what do we really mean by that? What do we really mean by that? I mean, I guess I could say one thing, like in the Myers-Briggs typology, Carl Jung's typology of personality types. One of the axes that he looks at is the intuitive versus the sensing. And I like to think of that as a spectrum. I like to imagine that he thought of it as a spectrum, but that's one way to contrast the word intuition is with this word sensing or the sensate function. But we don't have to talk in terms of Carl Jung's typology, just anything that comes up when you hear the word intuition, what does that even really mean?
Mm-hmm. And I do think that's important too, just because of language, because intuition in at least the Chinese, at least what I've read for Chinese philosophy, has everything to do with logic. So if you are a highly logical person, your intuition will be high as well, only because on some, subconscious level, you're able to connect certain things, but you're not consciously doing it. So it feels like intuition, like, oh, I feel this, but it's like, oh no, my brain put it all together before I could really, monitor it or look at it. So I think that's actually really interesting. But for intuitive specifically for me, I think it has a lot to do with how like the creative principle inside all of us manifests and how it decides to create a story. I notice a lot of intuitives are, at least for the most part, big into fantasy and just these ideas that are so, abstract, but when they begin to craft it, other people are able to, you know, actually digest it and be like, oh, this is some shit. Can I curse? Is that a thing? Is that okay? Okay. But yeah, for me, it's just have understanding that creative principle and then surrendering to that sense of it's really just allowing the creative principle inside of you to go off of that sense impression that you get with anything that you're interacting with. And that can be something as simple as, you know, just connecting the dots, or even just something on a whim of that doesn't really make any kind of sense, no logical sense. But on a higher spiritual level, it will make sense once you actually experience it. I don't know if that answers it, but that's how I felt.
I think that's interesting that you mentioned the logic part, because in Mother Peace has a lot to do with intuition. A lot of the cards are about, you know, kind of like the things that you're feeling are right, and that you know, like for instance, if the Judgment card is upright, that means that your sense of the world is right, and if it's reversed, maybe you're on the wrong path or something. Those sort of things. But it's always in opposition. And this comes out of their feminist critique of patriarchy. The idea of atomistic logic becomes aligned with the patriarchy in it. And so their readings a lot are like, okay, here's this, you know, in fact, the logic is tied with the swords suit. And the swords suit is a tragic suit. You know, the Nine of Swords being their culmination of rationality and logic is seen as this nightmare card. And it's the same card across the decks. It's a nightmare card where one is overcome with, you know, anxiety about all that they've thought of before. I think in the Rider Waite deck, it's actually a guy stabbed through the back by 9 swords. And then in Mother Peace, the portrayal of the 10 of Swords, which is the culmination of the swords path, is, you know, all these 10 people with swords throwing themselves into the ocean. You know, it's just I've let go of all of that overthinking and stuff. So I think that's interesting, you know, the difference between the I Ching's, what you're saying, the I Ching concept of intuition, that it's like informed by logic, and the either or kind of possibly false either or situation that Mother Peace sets it up for.
I find that really intriguing, this question of whether logic and intuition go together or whether they're at odds, because Moray, when I was listening to you, it sounded like in Chinese philosophy, there is a type of logic, at least, that is inherently intuitive. You know, the way you were talking about dots being connected, but not consciously, and somehow the intuitive answers generated, but in a rather mysterious way. But that's a kind of logic in itself. Whereas, like, David, when I hear you talk about logic, it sounds more like very rationalistic kind of logic. And I'm just wondering, maybe these are two different, maybe there is a logic in intuition and there's also a logic in reason, but they're different.
I'm thinking, you know, as I think right now, I'm listening to what you said, Andrea, and I know we talked about this earlier, the four of us, when we were in discussions on this. It makes me think of the difference between sensing and feeling. in the Myers-Briggs. That we live in a world that is very dependent upon just the senses, you know, what we see, objectivity, etc., as opposed to feeling, which is a subjective act.
I think that's so interesting. Is this a good, am I interrupting you? Were you
No,
about
go
to say
ahead.
something?
I'm done.
Okay. I was thinking about that too, because logic and the rational mind like definitely has its place and we need it, but it's also just like one kind of intelligence. And I'm a big big fan of thinking about all, like everything we know that we're not conscious of everything we know, right? So this intuitive path, in my mind, like is still rational. We just denigrate it somehow, right? So having whatever practice we have, whether it's reading or like staring at a blank page or walking or pulling a card, I think you all talked about connection, right? To ourselves and to other intelligences. I think it just makes more space for that receptivity to surprising logics that aren't like culturally received and just internalized, or or like our fears, right? Like the more that I practice, the more I can tell the difference between like, oh, this is very interesting, or this is just something I've been told to believe, or no, I just believe this is the only way it works because I'm terrified, right? And then I can
Moray, wanted to
and then I can
ask,
pull that apart a little bit.
I wanted to ask you, I just thought of this because on the whole idea of that, in a sense, like your ability to be logical, improve. Sounds like you're saying that in the Chinese, or the I Ching, improves your intuition. Did I get that right?
Well, now that I'm thinking about now that you say it and I'm thinking about it, I would say actually, yeah, it's certainly, there's contention for sure, trying to shed the mind of a particular kind of logic. Like I'm definitely a person who's very rational, to maybe a severe degree. So it gets in the way of my intuition a lot. But as I practice, I begin to see how this type of logic can really infiltrate and massage the layers of like possibility and probability for that kind of stuff. So it certainly does accentuate a little bit more. I think so.
And so I was thinking, because I know very little about I Ching at all. But your description of it, that it's very animistic from the standpoint of like understanding, you know, what each group of three is meaning, and then what the meaning of the I Ching from being like two groups of three. It almost sounds like it's almost like scientific and very dispassionate.
Yeah. It's funny that you say scientific, because as I was doing research to like feel ready for this whole panel, Carl Jung, who was very fascinated with the I Ching, was very surprised that the Chinese had not come up with their own science as the West had, which I thought was problematic. But the science that they do have for the I Ching is so heavily incorporated in various practices in Chinese culture. If it's not Qigong, if it's not Chinese medicine, if it's not even feng shui, just the way that they structure their life, the I Ching has infiltrated all of that, and it's been adopted and absorbed by various groups like Taoists. And you would think that that I Ching and Taoism are the same thing, because at this point they are. However, I Ching wasn't originally a Taoist practice. It was definitely more ancient Chinese. And as time went on, probably maybe because the is about 12,000 years old essentially, but it's the modernization that we see now is actually rather, it's old, but it's still fresh and new. But oh, I'm sorry, I like got on a tangent and I lost everything. But yeah, there is a science to the I Ching because it is a part of an actual cosmology. So the way that they're looking at how reality is structured, and even how the divine comes into, or the heavens reach down to the earth, and how that's produced, has a structure of the one becoming two. There's always a polarity in life, the yin and the yang, and within the yin and the yang, there's always the opposite. And there's perpetual change. Stagnancy leads to destruction, and it can either be toxic destruction or beneficial. So I think the science, let me answer the question. The science in the I Ching is about nature and transformation, one becoming something more or devolving into something lesser, and then just alternating.
That's interesting what you're saying about just real quickly, the whole idea of stagnation leading to destruction, and there's toxic destruction and beneficial destruction. That just reminded me, because again, in Mother Piece, the interpretation of the suit of swords, and then a lot of the major arcana that are very male centric, like the Emperor and the Hierophant and such. That is, I think they almost view it as like there's a stagnation because you're not allowing, you're just going by the sensing, quote unquote logical, quote unquote rational, standard way of thinking that is stagnating. And that the example of like the good destruction is the letting go at the end with the 10, or in major arcana, there's the tower. And the tower is definitely like, this structure is rotten and it needs to come down in order to create anything new. So it just reminded me.
I think with all of our systems, oh, Paula, were you going to say something?
It just made me think of the Nine of Cups as well, right? Which is like the wish fulfillment card.
Right.
Which is beautiful, except for if your wishes are fulfilled, then you stagnate because you don't.
Right.
That's, my introduction.
It's one of those, not to bring swords in, but a double-edged sword, I guess. I think this brings up a whole thing that I've, the whole act of doing these practices. Do you find sometimes it's like having to do a translation? If you're giving a reading for somebody, you have to definitely translate. I mean, if it feels to me, if I'm doing a reading for somebody on a tarot reading for somebody, I have to kind of translate what the cards are and what they're saying. And then, because I always say I'm not really giving the reading, you're giving the reading to yourself, but that there's kind of like a role that I have to help translate, the card to the person I'm giving the reading to.
Oh, absolutely. I definitely regard astrological readings as a practice of translation. I mean, that's definitely what it's about, because the symbols in an astrology chart, to me, are their own language. But most people that come for readings are not fluent in that language. And so they're asking for an analysis, and there's such an art to that. So if you tell someone that they're having a Saturn transit in Aquarius, through their 6th house, usually they'll look at you with this blank stare. It doesn't mean anything to many people. So you have to develop, I would say, a poetry in order to articulate some of the potentialities of that transit. And I feel like with astrology, it's important to me that we don't get too reductionistic or too deterministic about it, because any placement or any transit can have so many different effects. It all depends on the context, the consciousness that we bring. And so in that sense, to me, the most empowering way to regard astrology is to think of being sort of in collaboration with the cosmos. So yes, Saturn might be transiting through Aquarius. So if I know that, rather than kind of get really down, depressed, and then say, Saturn did that to me, I can instead say, well, I know I have this transit in this part of my chart. What are some ways that I can make the most of that? And with a Saturn transit, it will probably come down to creating a structure, creating or cultivating a work ethic, getting disciplined, kind of trimming the fat of life. So, getting rid of anything that's excessive or unnecessary and getting down to what's really essential. Those are Saturnian approaches that will serve us, so that when we have a Saturn transit, we don't feel that it's punishing us. We're actually strategizing to work with it so that it can be beneficial, to use that word again. So that's exactly what I just did, is I talked about a planet, but then I translated some of the possible meanings or significations of it. And there are infinite, it's infinite, really. Like every astrologer will interpret the same placement a different way. And so I do love that there's such a creativity to it. And I think some astrology readings have more value in this sense. If the astrologer can bring a more poetic, more sensitive language to the reading, it can be much more impactful. And the first astrologer that I worked with had that gift. I mean, it's like she opened her mouth, and when she talked about the stars, she was just reciting poetry to me. And I just remember like melting in her presence. I just wanted to listen and listen and listen, like I couldn't get enough. And I've had other astrology readings that felt much more clunky and kind of almost like too technical sometimes. I went in for a reading with someone, and they did the entire reading on a single aspect called the quincunx, which is a very, minute or relatively insignificant aspect in astrology. And the entire reading was so technical and all this jargon, and it didn't land. There wasn't enough translation, in essence. There wasn't enough transformation of the symbols in the chart into a poetic language that landed in my being. It didn't register. So that was a rant. I like the word translation, and I also like the word language overall for astrology. Like, people will call it a science. I definitely consider it an art. I consider analysis an art, astrological analysis. But it's like the way we practice astrology is decidedly through language. And sometimes I like to imagine that we could practice differently. Like, what if, your passion is in the culinary arts? And what if someone hired you for a reading, but instead of talking at them, which is what we tend to do, you went to their house and you made them a 6-course meal inspired by their natal chart? I mean, I like to think of these different ways that we could practice astrology, or, like you could dance for someone, dance their chart for them. It could be so much more. But right now we work through language, especially the spoken language.
That just reminded me that was yesterday, right? Paula, you and I spoke a bit, and you mentioned like writing poems based on readings for people.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that was what my project after the 2016 election, when I couldn't figure out why anyone would talk or write poems anymore for a little while. I had to kind of change my relationship to what I wrote about. And so, yeah, so what I did was I decided I wanted to write like a little gift for a friend, and I would have someone over for tea in the before times when people came over to your house. And I would give them a reading, and it would take about an hour, and we would talk about it. And then for the next week, I would just take notes about what we talked about and whatever else kind of came in from the world. And then I would draft a first draft of a poem and give it to them. And I've now written a whole manuscript that way. Definitely revised. I never really write a poem in a week and it stays the same, but it was a really, and like, they're not poems I could have written individually, right? Like everyone else. So it was another way to get rid of that big capital I that we all walk around with too. You know? So It was another way of knowing. So yeah, so everyone I've written a poem for is like thanked as a co-conspirator in that book too.
So just out of curiosity, what's the status of that manuscript?
It's a mystery. Light a candle, light a candle, say some prayers. I don't know.
Okay, definitely will.
Thank you. It'll find a home one day. I don't know. But yeah, it was a very meaningful project, and there was so much more hope. Again, my rational mind was like, we're all fucked, the world is over, and a little bit that was true, but also individually people had a lot of hope, and those places where I came together and knew things differently were such a magic, right? To have that different focus.
So I'm interested, Moray, how does that work? I mean, you must have to do a lot of like translation to make, I mean, certainly if you were to give me an I Ching reading, you have to go through a lot of translation to have it make sense for me.
Like I will say, so so it can be either claromancy or bibliomancy. Bibliomancy is the easiest one. I will not lie, I do that the most because I'm like, I just want you to get the reading you need. And honestly, it seems to be, it can be rather complex because the language itself, when you're doing it biblio, can be very specific, especially when it's all very mythologically based or just very culture bound. So once you start having to like translate, so if someone if you're like, oh, how is this marriage going to, last between us? And I cast it, and I get a hexagram, and let's say it's marrying maiden, which I believe is I would rather not say what the number is because but marrying maiden would be a hexagram that typically talks about one needing to subdue themselves in order for the marriage to work. When you read it, you're like, none of this actually makes any kind of sense. It seems to be about being good to your husband for the most part. It is rather sexist. And then it's also talking about certain things you need to do in order to keep a home happy. But once you like actually start reading it, and then you have to read translations from various other people, a lot of them mainly men, then you're like, oh, okay, this is talking about how one has to submit themselves in order for them to actually gain power in the relationship, or actually creating kind of like a harmonized union. So that can be simple. But when it comes to claromancy, this is when I get rid of the book and I'm just reading the lines. And reading just lines themselves makes no sense. You got six lines, either full or half. And when you see that, Like, look at this. Look at this. This makes no sense. What does this say? So if I'm casting any of this, I'm like, okay, yeah, I threw it. You got hexagram 38 here. 38. What does that tell you, David? Tell me what that tells you.
3 and 8's 11.
You know, but once you understand the elements that are comprised of it, then you're like, okay, so you have fire over lake. Okay, literally imagine a fire on top of a lake. What does that symbol now do to your, essentially your logic or your creativity? Um, well, fire and water shouldn't be mixing like that. So it sounds like something's polluted. It doesn't sound necessarily clean. And if we're just going to jump right to it, what is hexagram 38? Is it beneficial? Is it positive? Well, I should have had it ready. But estrangement, polarization. It's like once you start reading it, is it all backwards?
No.
Okay.
It's forwards. Yeah.
Okay, praise God. So yes, you have estrangement, opposition, polarizing. So you can literally think of the elements themselves and see how they actually interact in nature. And that will help you give the reading, because it's all just very simple. But once you want to get more in depth, when you're looking at the lines of yin and yang, then you're learning about the story of how these forces are interacting. And that's where it can get kind of complicated. And then that's when the ideograms of Chinese, like, so the kanji essentially are going to give you a bit more of an understanding of what it means, because some of the elements, when they're combining, make no sense until you actually see the ideogram and what that symbol is saying about those elements, if that makes sense. I know I got kind of out there.
Wow.
But on a linguistic level, yeah, depending on who you're trying to give the reading to, you're going to have to make it very simple of, yeah, it's really hot outside. This is nothing but a fire hexagram. You should get out of that situation. Or if someone has more of a creative mind, and they already, if you have a creative mind, then more than likely you've already thought of many situations to answer the question that you're asking. Well, then now I have to be like, okay, well, what aren't you able to pick up on, or what haven't you thought of? Then drawing from those symbols and giving it very poetically, I think actually allows them to adopt that idea or that consciousness, and then they're able to say, oh, no, that makes much more sense. And then vice versa, if I'm not able to think of, oh, well, why is this hexagram popping up? This doesn't really make sense, and these elements don't make sense. And the person's able to be like, oh, I can see why these two are combining. I can see why water and thunder, depending on how one on top of the other plays out, can be either very destructive or can be very inspirational. So yeah, I'm just kind of rambling at that point.
No, thank you. Thank you. I am wondering at this point if we want to take a break and then come back for more discussion and hopefully some reading. Does that sound cool to everybody?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's just do a few minute break, whatever. Stretch, get up, use the bathroom.